Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malaman in Highland Park, New Jersey at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation, Anshe Emet. Joining me upstairs here, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky from Anshe Emet in
Anshe Chesed.
Anshe Chesed. Sorry.
We're kind. You tell the truth, but we're kind.
I'm sorry, Anshe Chesed. And Rabbi Barry Chesler of no Anshe, but it's all Mashekta Day School in Long Island. Sorry about that. Welcome. It's great to see you guys. We have an amazing Parsha this week because every week's an amazing Parsha, and we have the privilege to study this with you. We thank you for being with us. Let's get right into it. Emor. Emor el Kohanim b'nei Aharon v'amarta aleim. What? There are three Emor, three Aleph Mem Reishes in the first pasuk. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Emor el Kohanim v'amarta aleim. Rabbi Barry Chesler, give us a little homily to start off with.
So I think the first thing to say is that speech is very important. And the Torah portion has a lot to say about physicality, the blemishes and disablements that could disfigure our bodies. But ultimately, and the Torah reading itself will end with a speech of sorts, blasphemy. And the beginning is to remind us of how important it is, how important speech is, how we talk, who we talk to, and what we talk about. And Rashi has a nice little comment. This is directed to the Kohanim because the Kohanim have a special responsibility as being the leaders to be even more careful with their speech than perhaps the people that they're talking to.
So it's very interesting. You know, there are plenty of synonyms for speech, but there's often made a dichotomy between amira and dibur. Dibur, and even in the consonants of amor and dibur, you get the sense that dibur is a little harsher, amira is softer, and I seem to recall midrashim on that theme where dibur is the harsh speech or the much more stringent and direct speech, amira is softer speech, and here it's a very interesting idea that the rules pertaining to the intimate lives of the Kohanim is directed in an intimate way, amira, in speech. And that's what...
So dibur is also used to mean revelation. Indeed. And I think the connection is that davar can mean both the word and the thing, and a dibur is something substantive, which is what we associate revelation with. And an amir with a silent aleph is more like a breath of air. Maybe perhaps a little more transient.
So the Parsha at the beginning deals with the relationships that Kohanim are allowed to have, and specifically who they mourn for. And then we go into a very interesting section, a section of qualifications for the Kohanim. And it's a focus on physical qualifications relating to the body. And as we read this and we discover the different kinds of things that delimit different kinds of Kohanim or disqualify Kohanim, we, I think, approach this whole topic with a different set of eyes. I think, Jeremy, you want to just help us understand, the world that we're talking about and our world in relationship to ability, disability, physicality, deformity, etc. I mean, these are small topics.
Small topics. Yeah, this is not, I think, a chapter that goes down all that smoothly for the contemporary reader because I think that there's maybe no speaking to my brother, my Canadian brother here. There's no maybe bit of American Jewish poetry that is as beloved as Leonard Cohen's line in Anthem. There's a crack. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Yeah. It's the imperfection that our contemporary spirituality loves to treasure, and we're suspicious of claims to perfection because we've been burned too many times by people who maybe come off as perfect, but then you look a little bit more closely, and you see that there's some dishonesty and some fakery, and so the apparent perfection turns out to be a bit of a scam. And so I think that in our world, both for that reason and because of a fundamentally wonderful, loving, ethical impulse, we are going, it's a major social imperative to see to it that that people, with certain kinds of physical impairments, disabilities, those don't become obstacles to their personal, professional, social flourishing. So, it's really important in American society nowadays to see to it that those barriers are removed. And this is not Parashat Emor's approach to the priesthood. Just like the animals that are offered on the altar have to be unblemished and they have to be whole and perfect, as the anthropologist Mary Douglas said about Leviticus, wholeness is the prerequisite for holiness. They thought that priests, just like the animals had to be good looking and perfect, they thought that the priests had to be good looking and perfect, and there had to be no missing limbs and no hunchbacks and no injuries to one's genitalia, no meroach ashech, ouch. We don't want any of that stuff. And I, as I try to move from my own contemporary kind of approach to these things to trying to intuit what ancient people might have thought, what I arrive at, and maybe this is right or maybe this is wrong, is that in our world where there's really kind of all in all a lot of health, we don't want to exclude the people who have troubles. In the ancient world where everybody was sick all the time and people didn't get better, and people's physicality was much more at risk, I think they were trying to create some sort of zone around the Beit HaMikdash, around the Mishkan, around the priesthood, around the religious shrine that didn't have all of that frightening brokenness stuff. But
profound, I think, idea, and of course it just illustrates the distance between our worlds, and especially in terms of the sense of the body, the picture of the body, the picture of vigor and strength as an ideal. What is the physical ideal? And I'm concurring with you, and I'm wondering if underneath this is an image of God issue, whether or not there is hovering in these depictions that the fullness of physical life gives you the fullness of God's image in you, which is, of course, something that we would not agree with as moderns. I know, Barry.
I think this is really significant. Tselem Elohim. If you want to read really literally, you want to give a little bit of hyper literal interpretation to that, especially reading through the idioms of rabbinic Hebrew. Tselem Elohim means that human beings are the idol of God, right? Like Heschel writes this, that Jewish opposition to idolatry doesn't mean that there are no idols. It means that there is only one adequate idol of the divine, and that is the human. And I think that they would have felt perhaps that if you look at the human being in its perfection, you see the divine. And if you look, in the broken or blurry image, it's just broken. It's a lesser manifestation. Now, I do think that our way, I mean, I live in the 21st century, so I find our way a little easier to understand, and I find it a little bit easier to resonate with it, even that all of us are the blurred and broken image of the divine, not the perfect and unblemished one.
So
I want to make
Go ahead.
I want to make a statement for the ancient world and suggest three things. Normally I have two things to say, but this is such an expansive topic that the first thing is this idea that the Kohen, as the offerer, has to be as perfect as the offering. That it's easy to think that our sacrifice is going to be better than we are. And by emphasizing these physical features of the Kohen, it's a reminder that the Kohen has to be as much as the sacrifice itself. The other way of looking at it is perhaps the Kohen himself is the sacrifice. That the animal, on one hand, is going to be offered to God on the altar, but the Kohen is offering himself. And therefore, he has to be perfect as well. But I think what strikes me listening to you talk is that our whole notion of wholeness has changed. And so we're really talking about something different than our ancestors on one hand. We live in a more inclusive society. but also something that's very much the same as well, because we're still talking about wholeness, but in a slightly different way. So in a little later in the Parsha, we're going to have a list of the holidays. And I'm reminded of this tension between Yom Kippur and the beginning of the Parsha. On Yom Kippur, we say at Kol Nidre that we are broken people and we're going to approach God in our brokenness. That's very foreign to this idea of perfection that we have at the beginning of the Parsha. But the Bratslaver Rebbe once said that there's nothing so whole as a broken heart. And I think that our wholeness today contains a lot more brokenness than our ancestors allowed for. But I also think that had they lived in Jeremy's 21st century, which I embrace as well, even though more than half my life, Nebuch was in the 20th century.
Until 120, Barry, until 120.
Okay, well, then that will make the 21st the dominant century. That, yes, I've lost my train of thought.
Well,
Had the ancient people lived in the 21st century.
Right, it had to do with wholeness and our sense of brokenness, which has changed. But if our ancestors lived in the 21st century, I don't know that they would have continued to maintain their standard of wholeness. I think they would have embraced ours as well, and seeing in us today worthy descendants of themselves.
But let me just make a small pitch, and I'm going to do a stretch here, which is, I think that there's also an incredible amount of physicality involved in the ancient cult, in the ancient religious life. You couldn't be a priest if you couldn't, carry an animal, or you couldn't hoist an animal and skin an animal. And a few weeks ago we were studying sacrifices. I went to these videos, these butcher videos, and I tried to do some research, and these guys, they're not small guys. There's a YouTube, the bearded butchers. Okay, you take a look at the bearded butchers. These guys, have a little bit of busser on them, if you know what I mean. They're strong guys. They're healthy guys. The butcher was always a person that had to, hoist around carcasses of meat. So there's something to be said for the physicality. There's something to be said for the social history of perfection, which is, I think, what we're talking about, and maybe the social history of beauty. And that I don't think it's directly said here, but there is an understated idea that your religious life should embody beauty in some way, and that the physical form is a beautiful form. While that's a Greek idea, to be sure, I doubt that our ancestors, all human beings like looking at beautiful human beings, and the idea of what constitutes a beautiful body or beautiful, it does change over time. Just take a look at the early 20th century. Look at who were the great actors of the Yiddish stage and Yiddish film, and these were people that you would not necessarily identify today as being beautiful, but they were gorgeous. They were beautiful in their time, and they expressed and they demonstrated a different ideal of physical beauty than we would appreciate. And Jeremy, you just said that they're filming someone on your block, right? And so tell us about that.
Well, just here in New York, we have lots of movies, and we had lots of celebrity sightings and stuff, and over the years. But they were just filming a movie outside the synagogue today, and I just noting like the actors just don't look like the rest of us. and isn't it so interesting? Isn't it interesting that, like, on the one hand, of course, we do think that the unmeetable ideals of beauty, especially for women who I think wrestle with this in a different way. I mean, I'm sure most of the men I know would also like to look like George Clooney or Brad Pitt, but it's just easier. I think
overrated. Overrated.
Richard Gere, then Robert Redford.
Give me a beard. Give me a nose.
You got a nose.
I want the Jewish beauty.
Okay, Gal Gadot then, baby. So, but I think it's obviously harder for women to make questions of body image and stuff. But we can imagine the ways in which that it's not psychologically healthy to venerate impossible standards of physical beauty. But it's also kind of like hard to disagree with what you were saying, that it's good to try to bring an aesthetic experience to religious worship. We want hidur mitzvah, like we make our religious spaces and our religious actions also beautiful. But it's hard to read this passage and not feel like it's fetishizing something that the rest of us will just never be able to live up to. I want to note, by the way, this in the course of talking about the animal sacrifices, there is one thing which I find really interesting, that an animal that is said to be sarua or kalut, what exactly those things are, I couldn't tell you, but there's somehow some sort of defect. I think our translation holds them as limb extended or contracted. They count for a nidava, but not a neder. So in other words, if you just say, oh, I would like to give this offering, you can give the animal with those imperfections. If you say, I hereby vow to give an animal, then you can't give that animal because it doesn't count enough as an animal. This one is a little close to forgetting that perfect offering. This one is a little bit down the road of saying, okay, there are certain things which, honestly, it's not an A+, okay? You have a real obligation, and if you do it this way, it's a little bit sloppy or slapdash, and so that doesn't really count as discharging your obligations, but it's also not nothing. And I kind of, I like that bit of a sliding scale in the worship, that, because in my own religious life, by the way, as a fairly traditional but not Orthodox Jew, I think that all or nothing, bad direction. I would always rather have a positive something than a negative nothing. And so I like this idea that you can make a nidava out of imperfection. You can't make a neder because that's a higher standard. And we recognize that there are ideals that we may not meet, but they're also not nothing. And so let's give ourselves a little bit of credit for when we do the best we can.
So let's shift to another concept that I think is really such an important, maybe precious concept in Judaism, and it's found in our parsha. The pasuk Lo techalalu et shem kodshi, do not desecrate my holy name. The nikdashti betoch bnei Yisrael ani Hashem ekadishchem, so that I shall be sanctified in the midst of the people of Israel. Hamotzi etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, who took you out of Egypt to be your God. This is the concept of kiddush Hashem, of sanctifying God's name, which is really, a deeply central concept in our Jewish public behavior. The awareness of our Jewishness in the public sphere is a sanctification of God's name when we do things that are good, things that are even little things. I mean, if we do a mitzvah in public, that's a kiddush Hashem.
Right.
We in a way, we can prime ourselves to reading the news. Bernie Madoff passed away, last week. Okay, not kiddush Hashem, right?
Couldn't happen to a nicer guy.
Right, Hillul Hashem. Okay, so because it defames all of us, right? Defame. Even when he was sentenced, and even I wonder what happened. I mean, I wonder who buried him. Where did I mean, what happens? And we don't know. I don't know. If you got the call, Jeremy.
I'm glad I wouldn't, because I'm glad I didn't, at least in that case didn't, because on the one hand, I feel myself that if somebody said to me, listen, here's a person who's a bad person, and he's dead now, and will you help his family say goodbye to that person? I think that I would want to say, yeah, I'm going to come through for you in this bad moment. But that rotten person, I mean, he was like a uniquely bad person. I certainly would not have wanted to do that. But I think exactly what you said, Elliot, about Hillul Hashem, the desecration of the divine name, and V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, that I, the divine, will be sanctified amidst the children of Israel, means that we have a community whose behavior in our own public square, but also to the gaze of other people towards our community, should be one that says, look at those Jewish people. They do, in fact, make the name of God beautiful. I mean, there's this great line in the Gemara of Yoma about, v'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you shall love the Lord your God. But et, literally, the particle et can mean with. And so the question is, well, what is the with particle? What is the ribui? What is the expansion of love the Lord your God? And the Talmud there says, Sheyehei shem shamayim mit ahev al yadcha, that the name of heaven should become more beloved through your behavior. And like if you see people behave beautifully, you say, what a wonderful culture, what a wonderful religion, what a wonderful Torah. And if you see people behaving like scoundrels, you will say, what a terrible religion, what a terrible culture, what a terrible Torah.
It places a tremendous responsibility, especially those of us who publicly go on with our public symbols, our kippot or whatever we are wearing. We comport ourselves with these symbols in our own awareness of God, but also aware that we are playing a role for the sanctification of God's name in almost everything that we do. Barry, you want to react to this?
Yeah, I'm struck here by a couple of different ideas. So the Bernie Madoff's death raises some interesting issues in that obviously once he dies, he needs to be buried, and that's a communal responsibility. And as far as I know, there really is no way in Judaism for someone who is a human being to become a non-human being. So the kiddush Hashem would be to give a properly respectful burial to someone who was so deficient in many Jewish and human qualities. And that could actually be a sanctification of God's name. Yeah, go on.
I was saying, in addition to taking care of the family, if there were survivors, and that would be the
right.
focus.
But also, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, as you, Jeremy, I think you used the phrase, he was uniquely bad, but he was also uniquely human, as each of us is. And we sometimes lose sight of that fact. And, when you raise the issue of kiddush Hashem and Hillul Hashem, I was struck by the following. There are some things that are obviously a sanctification of God's name and a desecration of God's name, where you don't need an expert to tell you what the difference is. But there are also things that start out as a sanctification of God's name that can become a desecration, and that where the bad motive completely colors an action that would seem to be a positive action. And that's what we have to be on guard against too, that if we keep in mind our goal to sanctify God's name always, we'll be in a much better position than if we put ourselves as the goal aside from everything else. And, in Madoff's case, not to belabor the point, that is what he did. He put himself and his family perhaps in front of everything else and destroyed institutions and families to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I want to just note, it's going to take me a little bit more time to find the spot. Here it is in the Mishnah in Sanhedrin chapter 6. First of all, it's a beautiful drash about the way. This is Mishnah Sanhedrin chapter 6, Mishnah 5. There's a beautiful drash about how God suffers at the loss of any human being. Im ken hamakom mitztaer al damam shel rishayim, kal vachomer al damam shel tzadikim. If God cares about the death or the blood of the wicked people, how much more so of the righteous people? But it goes on to say that there were different graveyards for those who were executed by the court. So yes, it's true. You don't cease to become a human being. You have to be buried, but you don't get to go to the ancestral tomb with full regalia and full honor. Like there's got to be some sort of way in which the community says, yeah, you are a human being, but we don't want to have anything to do with you and your rottenness. And especially with a guy like Bernie Madoff, who, in addition to the massive amounts of thieving that the person did to other human beings, stole so much tzedakah from the Jewish community. Like, if you steal tzedakah, you are low.
All right. So speaking of sanctification and kiddush Hashem, one of the ways that we exercise kiddush Hashem is in the holiday cycle. I mean, we are living out the Jewish narrative in the holidays, and so much of this parsha is familiar to us because we do read it within the holiday cycle on one of the Yom Tovim, starting with the passage Shor o Kesef Ki Yivaled, but and then it goes to Ela Moadei Adonai, right? These are the sacred occasions of the Lord, okay? And it starts with Shabbat and goes in through the holiday cycle through the first month of the year, which is Nisan, and therefore the holiday of Pesach, on through Yisrat Omer, which we are in right now, to Shavuot, to Sukkot, or to what is Rosh Hashanah, although the word Rosh Hashanah is not used there, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, etc. So give us your drush on the holidays. Maybe I'll ask the question. I'll lead you, which is
Elliot, give us your drush on the holidays.
I'm going to give you my drush on the holidays. Let's say as follows. I think holidays, that what we have here is a snapshot of the location of the holidays in the midst of the holiness code. That is, you access holiness through the holiday occasion. That's of course the simple explanation. But we know through our experience living in America that holidays have their own history. And you see that also in the Bible. And what is fascinating in the Bible is that you have this calendar here, you have another calendar in Dvarim, you have another calendar in Bamidbar, you have another calendar in Shmot. These are different places where different aspects of the holiday are mentioned. And if you take a look at the civic cycle of holidays in America, be it Independence Day, Memorial Day, or Thanksgiving, you can see that from the origin of these holidays 150, 200 years ago, maybe more, there is a social history to that. These holidays have evolved. And I think that each generation and each historical epoch brings a different narrative to the holidays as we experience that in the Bible, in the Torah.
This is a great example of how poetic things never mean just one thing. Poetic things always have a rich, resonance of nuance and meaning. And Pesach and Shavuot here in Parashat Emor are really described as being agricultural. And we sort of, we conservative rabbis grow up on the idea of, religious evolution and what things meant at a certain time. And all the holidays were originally either agricultural, like these springtime holidays and the harvest holidays, or kind of astronomical, like Hanukkah falling at the winter solstice and stuff like that, and Purim around the springtime carnival. But then they acquire kind of historical meanings. When we come to Emor, the holidays are really agricultural. Pesach is the beginning of the barley harvest, and then Shavuot sort of the later high wheat harvest, and then oddly enough, in our passage for this week, it's Sukkot that has the remembrance of leaving Egypt, because Ki bas Sukkot hoshavti et bnei Yisrael b'hotzii otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. I let you dwell, or I made you dwell in booths when I took you out of Egypt. It's like, what? I thought Passover was the holiday about leaving Egypt, but in Parashat Emor, at least in this passage, that association is applied to Sukkot.
Yeah, very on the holidays.
I wanted to add two things here. So the first thing is that for those of us who read the Bible critically, we have here the fusion between Pesach and Matzot. That Pesach, as we talked about a few weeks ago, maybe a few months ago already, was originally a shepherd's holiday, and Matzot a farmer's holiday. The symbols of each reflect the culture in which they began. A sheep for the Paschal sacrifice, and matzah, which is a bread product for the farmer. And what happens here in Emor is that the Pesach is offered in the late afternoon of the 14th, and matzot begins the next day, so that you only have to offer one sacrifice. You could have, rather than have to bring two sacrifices separately, you can now just bring one. The other thing I would note in connection with Yom Kippur is the different way in which rabbis and modern scholars work. So the expression we have with Yom Kippur is that it's observed from evening of the 9th to evening of the 10th. It's the only holiday in the Bible that begins in the evening. And so for the rabbis, this becomes the dugma for all the other holidays. It's mentioned here, of course, because it's not just about Yom Kippur, it's about all the other holidays. But if you look in a modern scholar such as Baruch Levine, he points out that this was probably the only holiday that began in the evening, that every other holiday originally in the Bible probably began in the morning and then ended at the evening, which is how the sacrifices work, the Tamid in the morning and the Tamid in the late afternoon. And it's, fascinating to me because we have two very different views of words that could not seem to be plainer in their meaning to someone with who's reasonably conversant in biblical Hebrew.
Okay, on that note, we have this kind of postscript to the Parsha, which includes this moment of cursing. An Israelite man or a son of an Israelite woman, who's also the son of an Egyptian man, he goes out into he's fighting with some other dudes, and he Vayikov ben Aisha Yisraelita Hashem. He curses God's name, or how do you translate Vayikov?
Well, that's why it's such a great line, because
yeah.
It's punctures, and lechalel is also a word that could mean to make a hole. So to not a WHOLE or a holy, which are words in this context that signify like goodness. It's the name can be punctured or the name can be eroded. And so what I take away from this, the story at the end here of the Mikalel or the blasphemer, is not only that he said a bad thing, but that the name of God is quite vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's not that God is it's not that God is impervious. Like, at a certain level, it's like, well, what does God care about if we worship idols or not? So what? Or what does God care if we blaspheme? God is eternal and big deal, and nothing happens here could affect the eternal and infinite. Actually, that's not the biblical mindset. The biblical mindset is that the divine needs human care, and if you mess it up, you put a hole in it.
Right, and that God's name is vulnerable, and that as we said earlier in a different way, the Jewish people is a vessel for God's name, and we have to care. And it's interesting that this is a violation of the third commandment, and it was the scholar David Noel Friedman, who said maybe the first 9-10 books of the entire Bible are organized around different violations of the 10 commandments. Here, we find the violation of the third commandment in the third book. Is that a coincidence? And the notion that the most severe of penalties would come to the person who violates God's name, because if you ruin God's reputation, there's nothing much you can do about that. God can't really do anything about that, unless.
Well, so to follow along that, Elliot, so the Mikoshesh, the guy who goes out on Shabbat and gathers the wood, is in the fourth book, the fourth commandment in the fourth book.
Right, and the Parasha Emor is in the fifth book, who is a theoretical construct, the rebellious child.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting, eh? Not bad.
And I'm sure we can carry this all the way through, but it's true that
David Noel Friedman was no slouch when it came to the Bible. So I don't think he would have said it if there wasn't something to it. But I want to draw our attention to
conversant with biblical, as you said, passively conversant with biblical Hebrew.
Indeed. Go ahead, Barry.
I wanted to suggest something else, that what I find most fascinating about this story, and it's one of the few stories that we have in Parashat Vayikra, which we have to, in Sefer Vayikra, which we have to remember. Almost the entire book is law and narrative, and here we have a story, is that they don't know what to do with this guy. So I don't know, it's not quite a violation of the third commandment, because I would think that for the 10 commandments, they knew exactly what to do. And in my reading, I'm not entirely convinced that they need to find out what the specific punishment is.
Well, it's interesting. The Midrash, it picks up on this. It gives us a whole backstory to which we don't have time to go into. But you read that and you say, like, maybe he had a good reason. He was he went to a court, he lost in a court, and he felt that the whole court was stacked against him. And he said, basically, you know, to hell with you and your courts, basically, in stronger terms.
So what's important here is that there are a few cases in the Torah where Moses doesn't know what to do.
Yeah.
Right? We like to think that he got everything at Mount Sinai. And then we have these stories where the people don't know what to do, and Moses has to go ask God, what am I supposed to do? And it gives us a theory of human and divine communication that we often don't get in what used to be called Sunday school.
Indeed. Well, on that note, on human and divine communication, which is what the study of Torah is all about, we're trying to figure it out. And it's been a wonderful time to be with. We thank you all, our listeners, watchers, everywhere you are, whether you are here or in Canada or around the world. Thank you for watching Parasha Talk. We love you. Send us your questions, and we'll see you again next week on another edition of Parasha Talk. Shabbat Shalom. Shalom.